All right. Welcome to, I guess, one of the first sessions for New York City School of Data. You are in the session for City of Yes, using data to unlock economic opportunities. We're going to get started. It's 11 o'clock now. I'm Andrew Buck. I am a senior urban planner and technologist. I am a co-chair for the American Planning Association, New York Metro Chapter's Technology Committee. But I also practice planning at a VHB, planning, engineering, and technology consulting firm as well. And I'm joined here by Miriam, and we'll just do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll kind of kick off.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Yakubi. I'm the chair of the Zoning and Land Use Committee for APA New York Metro Chapter. I'm also a zoning and planning specialist at Department of City Planning, and I'll pass the mic to Mike with our colleagues.
I'm Joyce Ching. I'm a zoning planner at the Department of City Planning.
Good morning. Nicholas Moore, City Planning, Economic Development and Planning Division. Christopher Lee, Senior Planner at the Department of City Planning.
Today we're gathered to talk about the City of Yes, which is one of the largest and most important measures that are happening in New York City right now, changing how business, housing, and sustainability will be done in the future. As a background, this presentation was put together by the APA New York Metro Chapter. We are a professional organization that's focused on bringing planners, but also communities together to just build better places overall. APA is a national level professional association, but we have chapters in each major city and municipality throughout the U.S. Underneath that, we have our two committees, the Technology Committee and the Zoning Legislation Committee as well. And if you want to learn more or get involved, we are always throwing events like this together. Go to nyplanning.org. You can pretty much get linked in that way too. For our overall talk today, we have a DCP here with us to kind of talk about how the City of Yes for Economic Opportunity has really done a fantastic job in terms of just taking data and using that to really inform policy overall. And we'll be really talking about how that really is looking at modernizing how businesses are being classified in zoning, are really taking these tools and also using it to simplify rules for how businesses are allowed to work with commercial streets, and then how do you kind of remove restrictions on reoccupation to really address the vacant storefronts as well. At the last portion, we'll open it up for just open discussion. So if you have any questions, think about that and feel free to ask it at the end of this session. And with that, I'll pass it over to Miriam to walk us through City of Yes.
Yes, thanks for that, Andrew. I think as planners, city residents, and land use enthusiasts, we're at a very unique position in the history of New York City land use. Planning, as the Department of City Planning is putting forward 3 different sort of initiatives that change the land use landscape and the public realm around New York City. When we were thinking of putting this panel together, it was no-brainer that we had to have an event on one of these packages. So I'm going to mix. There's 3 City of Yes. If the slide moves. There's currently 3 City of Yeses that are making their rounds through public review, with the first one, carbon neutrality, that just passed through City Council. Economic opportunity was referred out by the City Planning Commission, and it's also going through public review. And lastly, we have the housing opportunity initiative that's just starting to make its way through public review. With that, I'm going to hand the mic to my colleague, Christopher Lee. He's the senior planner at the Department of City Planning, who's been working on economic opportunity, specifically parsing through data and cleaning our current land use regulations as part of the project.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. my colleagues here, Louisa, Nick, and I, we're part of a larger team that worked on economic opportunity. And this project really is a coordinated effort between multiple divisions, agencies across the city to update our commercial use regulations and to see how we can better classify businesses across the city. And what our team has proposed here is actually quite significant. I mean, these regulations that we're touching and amending haven't really been updated since the 1960s, since the birth of modern day zoning in New York City. Before we get into the nitty-gritties of the proposal itself, just want to talk a little bit about how zoning works and how it affects businesses overall. Zoning is very much administered through zoning districts. In every part of the city, every property is covered by at least one zoning district, and there's hundreds of different types of zoning districts across the city, each with their own unique set of rules, restrictions, and allowances as to what you can build and what you can't build. So inevitably, zoning is also going to regulate business types, right? Zoning is also going to regulate, in a lot of cases, how much of this establishment you can build or how much you can occupy within a storefront. Zoning also regulates where commercial space can occupy within a building, right? Especially when it comes to buildings with residential units and apartments. And our regulations for businesses were written back in the early 60s, and they've been largely intact since the 60s. There's been a few tweaks here and there, but for the most part, we haven't updated them for several decades, right? So, and what that means is that there's actually quite a bit of business types that are referenced in the zoning that are no longer relevant, right? We have things like telegraph offices that don't really exist anymore. But we also have new industry types in this current economy that have not been accounted for since the 1960s, right? So what does that mean for businesses? Well, if I'm opening up a rock climbing facility, right, how do I look at the regulations that apply to me, right? That's one big way in which zoning is incomplete. There's a lot of different types of archaic regulations as well that are just inappropriate for this day and age that we're looking to remove through this proposal. One of which is if you notice that there's a lot of, in certain parts of the city, there's a lot of vacant storefronts in primarily residential areas, and they've been sitting vacant for some time, right? And somewhere down in the zoning, you have a time limit as to when you can reoccupy this space with another commercial user or business type. But for whatever reason, this space, say the pandemic hit, and they weren't able to find another tenant for that. So it's sitting vacant, and the zoning is getting in the way for that. So these are sort of like the types of issues that we've noticed in the zoning. And that has really prompted us to really do a deep dive into how we can better improve our rules so that works not against businesses, but for businesses. And with that, we, over the last couple of years, engaged with small businesses as well as other stakeholders to see what their concerns are and how we can accommodate their needs through this project. Which brings us to the City of Yes economic opportunity. So this project can be summarized in 4 general goals. We want to make it easier for businesses to find space and grow. We want to support emerging industries. We want to enable more business-friendly streetscapes. And we want to create zoning tools that will encourage building typologies that will better accommodate industries and job centers. For the purposes of today's presentation, we'll focus on goals 1 and 3, make it easier for businesses to find space and grow, and goal 3, which is enable more business-friendly streetscapes. So starting off with goal number 1, we have 3 different work streams that we'd like to highlight today. We want to, as part of goal number 1, we want to update the classification system, which I'll be covering. Then we'll talk a little more about some of the geographical inconsistencies in which we allow or restrict different types of businesses. That's something that Nick will cover. And finally, we'll talk a little more about our vacant storefront work stream, and that's also something that Nick will cover. And we'll end it off with Louisa, who will talk more about goal number 3. So beginning with goal number 1, we want to try and modernize our classification system. And before I go into the issues of our classification system today, the zoning very much relies on what we call use groups. There are 18 different types of use groups in the zoning that classifies different types of businesses and uses that could possibly exist in the city today. So the authors of the zoning back in the 1960s thought that this would be an exhaustive and complete list of, the housing typologies, the business types, and they did a very tedious job of classifying all these different uses based on the characteristics and compatibility into these 18 use groups. And under each of these 18 use groups, we have a list of very specific business types that are allowed and permitted. And use group 1 and 2 are residential uses. So we have single family housing, we have detached, 2-family apartments, condos, that kind of stuff. And residential uses are generally permitted are permitted in most places in the city, except for heavy, industrial and heavy manufacturing areas of the city. Then we have similarly community facilities like libraries, schools, and hospitals that are also permitted in most places except for heavy manufacturing districts. And then we have, and this is like the brunt of our use group classification, which is commercial uses, spanning from use group 5 through 16, and each of these use groups represent different types of commercial establishments. And the authors thought that it would be a good idea to lump, the local mom and pop, retail and service establishments in use group 6, and then the larger retail establishments in use group 10, and then semi-industrial uses in use group 16, right? So they really thought through and saw that this would be a good way of allowing for different types of commercial uses. And these establishments are generally permitted in commercial and manufacturing districts, but the caveat is that, the types of commercial establishments permitted vary by zoning districts. So you can have one commercial district that allows for, let's say, use group 6, 7, 10, 11, and then you'll have another commercial district that only allows for use group 6 and 14, right? So there's a lot of inconsistencies, and it totally varies, and it can be quite confusing, not just for the business owner, but for regulators like us and enforcement agencies. And then finally, we have manufacturing uses, which are the last two, 17, 18. They're only allowed in industrial manufacturing districts. The authors of the zoning back in 1960 did a pretty Herculean job. I mean, creating this classification system, looking at all the uses and then grouping them together, that is, remarkable. But over time, we found that the framework is actually quite incoherent and inconsistent. And these are some examples. If I'm a restaurant owner and I want to know what regulations pertain to my business, I would have to sift through 3 different use groups that include 5 different versions of eating or drinking establishments. And that's just dumb, in my opinion. A more intuitive classification system would just be to look at one use group and say, hey, these are the different types of restaurants, right? Instead of having to go through hundreds of different pages of bylaw just to find out what regulations pertain to your establishment. And because the authors at the time thought that they could create a very specific list of uses, I mean, for the last 6 to 7 decades, there's been other types of industries that have emerged. So they have, the list itself is incomplete now, right? So one example of this is recreation establishments. They've only considered, between 5 to 8 recreation establishments in the zoning resolution, such as pool halls and, table tennis halls and bowling alleys. But what about, again, escape rooms, right? There's all these other types of recreation establishments that have not been, added to the zoning. And then within each use group, there's also just uses that are grouped together that are just vastly, just incompatible, or that there's no rhyme or reason or common characteristics between these different types of facilities and uses, right? So one case is in use group 9, we have business schools and costume rental establishments, right? So how does that make sense? What are the similarities between business schools and costume rental establishments? So with all of these issues, we're like, okay, we got to clean this up quite a bit, which is kind of the reason why we're like, okay, let's find a new framework. And so the goal of this new framework, we're looking to re-envision how classification of business types work in the city through zoning. And the goals are to create a framework that is comprehensive and broad enough to account for uses not listed, right? A framework that is adaptable and can be more easily updated over time. And a grouping of uses that actually are intuitive and make sense, right? Groups of uses from the same sector, from the same building type, uses that have the same type of land use impact and locational needs, as opposed to having groups that are supposedly compatible with one another based on our own opinion of what compatibility means. And so naturally, the first step is to look at the North American Industry Classification System, or what we call NAICS. And this classification system was a joint effort between Mexico, Canada, and the United States to have a better way of classifying different types of industries for the purposes of data collection. This classification system replaced what was then the standard industry classification, which is what was used back in 1960 to carve out all the uses in our zoning resolution today. So our zoning is actually very much behind. This NAICS classification system was adopted back in the 1990s. And we feel like this is a very good first step, a good baseline for our use categorization. The American Planning Association considers this to be best practice. It does a fairly good job in classifying retail establishments and service establishments, as well as production uses. And the level of specificity from sector to subsector, industry group, industry provides the flexibility that we need to write better zoning. And so as part of this exercise, on the one hand, we want to re-envision how the framework looks like in the future. On the other hand, we also have to retain certain decisions that were made a couple of decades ago as it relates to like public health, right? We don't want to inadvertently allow like heavy industry uses in residential areas, right? So we want these specific policy decisions to remain in place in the zoning. So what we had to do was to assign the existing uses to our new NAICS classification system. So that was one exercise. The other exercise is to really determine the level of specificity. And we found that between the 3 and 4 digit code in NAICS made the most sense. This is an example here. We have furniture, home furnishing, electronics, and appliance retailers. And under that, we have furniture and home furnishing retailers. In the old classification system, they would list out all the highlighted uses, right? Furniture retailers, home furnishing retailers, floor covering retailers. But in our new framework, we would just omit those highlighted, specific retailers, because in the future, there may be a dozen more. And we don't want to have to update it all the time based on, new businesses coming up left and right from the same, sector and subsector. So to the very right, you get what we have in the zoning now, which is specific enough but broad enough to encompass all sorts of uses under these sectors and subsectors and industries. And the policy outcome is that now we have a cleaned use group classification system that has from 18 use groups to 10, and all of these use groups and uses under each bucket is mutually exclusive, so it's more intuitive. It's hopefully easier, more predictable for people to use, and for regulators and enforcement agencies to see, like, okay, if I'm a restaurant, then I can just look at use group 6. So with that, I'll pass it over to Nick to talk about work stream number 2, under goal number 1. Thank you.
Hopefully this works. Good morning, everybody. So I want to begin by reiterating one of the things that Chris mentioned, which is that, this proposal and all the work involved in it, multi-step multi-agency effort, and the specific topics that we're going in today are just a very small sample of some of the work that was done. And in the next two sections that I'm going to be talking about, moving on. So where I want to start is talking about this arbitrary distinction between commercial districts. So Chris touched on this a little bit, but in zoning, when it pertains to commercial districts, you have C1 through C8. The numbers very generally tell you like the intensity, right? So like 1 and 2 are your lower intensity, 4 to 6, kind of your commercial corridor, that sort of thing, and the others, Coney Island and more industrial. But so a specific thing in the proposal was, there was this idea or thought that like C1 and C2 districts nowadays tend to look very similar, and some of those outdated rules, didn't make sense, but also, especially in height of the pandemic, we saw that it was probably a barrier to some businesses, like, expanding or changing uses. And in this example here, you're allowed like a theater on one side of the street and not on the other. And like an example of a bicycle shop, if you start doing, repair or, sales or rentals, it's a different use group. So we want to simplify those things. So looking specifically at C1 and C2 districts, we want to simplify the rules of businesses that are allowed on these commercial streets. These places have similar retail environments, so why not, try to have them make more sense? So a specific question is like, is the distribution of the use groups 1 through 18 that Chris mentioned, what do they look like in C1 and C2 districts across the city? So the task then, of course, is this true? How do we do it? So this section, I'm going to talk on the data involved in trying to answer that question. I also wanted to mention, I feel like these next two sections, the analysis itself, I wouldn't say is necessarily like arduous or groundbreaking, but I think these are great examples of like how we use data to answer questions in the present and in the future. These are common data sets that we here use, and probably others of the public use as well. So we want to put them into context. Organizing this section, I want to start with what's actually available on open data. The primary one that some of you may be familiar with is what's called Map Pluto. The map just means this is a spatial file, and the Pluto is an acronym for Primary Land Use Tax Lot Output. This is one of our agency's most popular, widely used, I think, data sets. It's a series of over 800,000 tax lot polygons around the city, and attached to those polygons are over 70 different fields of attributes, ranging from anything from like building classes, FEMA flood zones, land use categories, lots of zoning related features. So it's robust. It's available on open data, as you see in the screenshot here, and it's also available for download on our website. I also want to talk about other public data. So we actually, this analysis I'm about to describe wouldn't have happened if not for the work that Chris and his team had done. So this is building off of putting into practice that NAICS to use group classification schema. The third data set and to point out here is what's called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, or QCEW as it's commonly known. The screenshot here is an example of the public-facing product of QCEW. This is a screenshot of the dashboard on the state's DOL website. You can look at all types of sector and industry breaks by New York City, the state, and counties. However, this data is not available publicly. This is but simply to maintain confidentiality of the individual establishments that are part of this data. But through a data sharing agreement, some government agencies and I think related researchers and that can obtain that confidential data set and process it for different types of analyses. We've had this agreement for over a decade, and we use it for a variety of different things. We process it in-house. It's a data set of over, depending on the quarter, over 200,000, 250,000 records of individual establishments all across the city. And attributes associated with them are things like wages, employment for the quarter. But most importantly for this conversation, it comes with a NAICS code. Because like I said, the data is confidential, so I can't show a specific example. I don't actually own a tofu scramble full-service restaurant below our office, but it gives you a sense of like what's in the data, and we process this to try to answer a variety of questions. Commonly, I would say like neighborhood studies. We release figures about sectors and employment in aggregate. But for the purpose of this conversation, I want to focus on the NAICS code. So getting into the methodology, this is pretty straightforward, but the point here is we take joins from a variety of different data sets, don't ultimately wind up with a more complete like QCW spreadsheet that contains a use group and a zoning district. So we use that schema that Chris talked about, where a use group is linked to a NAICS code. We're able to join based on that NAICS code to the NAICS and QCW. And then because QCW has a BBL, thanks to the processing we do in-house, we can then take that BBL to Map Pluto, which contains zoning district fields. And then in the end, we have a final workbook that contains the attributes I need for this analysis: a zoning district, a use group, a NAICS code, a BBL. So to sum that up, the main takeaway from this table I want to show is that we basically confirmed our hypothesis that we see that across the city, existing use groups in C1 and C2 districts see a very similar distribution. The biggest exception just being in 6A with retail or services, but even that's a matter of a couple percentage points. Citywide across everything from like commercial and retail categories, we see a very similar distribution. So this helps, bring home the point that there's little meaningful distinction between these zoning districts, and we can simplify these things. I'm going to go through one more example. This has to do with vacant storefronts. So a particular part of the policy was to remove restrictions on reoccupation of vacant storefronts. So of course, not just in the pandemic, but we don't want to see vacant storefronts around the city, right? So in zoning as it is now, if a business is in a something other than what's called an R5 or an R6, they're not allowed to reoccupy if they've been vacant for more than 2 years. So we want to expand those provisions to allow for more like flexibility and reopening storefronts that have been vacant. So a question here is, is vacancy actually prolific in the majority of residential districts and also what's called historic districts? And to do that, of course, we need a series of polygons that tell us about zoning and historic districts, and we need something that talks about storefronts. So in a similar series, I want to highlight the data that was used. So beginning on open data, what's available there? We have zoning districts. These are irregular polygons. They don't conform to the tax lots like the Map Pluto shapefiles did. This allows for a little bit more flexibility, especially if you're working with point data. These are updated on an as-need basis, usually monthly. The screenshot you see here is from one of our mapping products. It shows you residential, commercial, and manufacturing districts. It's similar to Pluto. This is available on open data as well as our website for download. I mentioned historic districts. This is not maintained by us. It's from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but it's also available for download on open data. These are also irregular polygons. And as I mentioned, we're talking about storefronts in this case, right? So it's important to note that is this publicly available? The screenshot I have here is a product called Storefronts Reported Vacant or Not. This is maintained by the Department of Finance. So there is a storefront data set available. This is fairly recent. In the last couple of years, it was mandated by Local Law 157, which was an attempt to get businesses around the city to be more forthcoming about how long they've been vacant, what their rent is, things like that. It's a point level data set. This is great to have. However, in short, I would say after some exhaustive research, we found that it's not as complete as we would like for especially a citywide analysis like this. It tends to favor Manhattan. There's not a lot of enforcement behind it. So there are some limitations. And as this proposal and the research involved was coming along in the early stages, this was all that was available to us. However, somewhat recently, we were able to obtain another data sharing contract with a storefront, what do we call them? a storefront database called LiveXYZ. This is an example, or a screenshot of their public-facing product. This is available to anyone. It gives you information. It's similar to Yelp in a way. I think it's fair to say kind of where they want to go. It's robust. It's citywide. It's fantastic. Lots of categorization, lots of information, and it's updated on a rolling basis. So we were able to obtain, along with some other city agencies, the back-end data of this. So we have access to the far more information than that's available publicly. So that includes things like occupancy status. That's the big one. Different types of categories, how long it's been vacant, things like that. So of course that makes it fantastic for us to do a query of this question. So the methodology here is basically pretty simple. We're just merging these two zoning and historic polygons, and then from there we can spatial join that with the LiveXYZ points that we had. On the right shows you what citywide vacant storefronts, and then in the end, the map shows here. This does confirm our hypothesis that there is a great deal. There's thousands of vacant storefronts citywide in these districts, so it does help legitimize the need to expand these provisions to allow businesses to reopen. Kind of wrapping up here, the last few slides I talked about were about how we use data to inform policy. And in this example here shows how one example of how we use some of the same data to inform the public. So on the left, you see a table of jobs, which comes from that QCW data set I mentioned. And on the right, you see a map and a chart of how we've used LiveXYZ. The geography you see on the map is a community district 1 in Lower Manhattan. So the city is broken up into over 50 community districts. When we did the public outreach process, our planners use slides like this to help inform the public and help the conversation about what's happening in your neighborhoods. So the LiveXYZ portion, we were able to group their business categories into a way that matched as best as possible existing use groups, so things like community facilities, services, things like that. And on the left, we're able to talk about jobs at a macro level. And we'll move on. And yeah, as I do want to mention before I forget to, if you want to learn more about Map Pluto, for example, one of our colleagues, Damon in infrastructure, and Technology, I forget the name of their division, is going into great detail about that in an hour. And if you want to learn more about QCW, the Mayor's Office of Management and Budget gave a presentation a few years ago on how they use the same QCW data to release seasonally adjusted citywide employment figures. So, thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Goal 3, which is enable more business-friendly streetscapes. And the objective here was to create a streetscape framework that would deliver active, safe, and walkable streets for businesses and residents. So what we wanted to do here was create a really consistent and easy to understand set of rules for ground floor design that would address things like active ground floor uses, parking wrapping and screening, or storefront transparency. These are just a few of the elements that the zoning already addresses today through existing urban design regulations, but we wanted to see if there is an opportunity to build out maybe a more robust framework to create more welcoming retail corridors across the city. And so one of the main issues that we wanted to address was that while the zoning resolution does already have many streetscape rules, most of them only really apply to a certain number of geographies, so special purpose districts and special areas. And this leaves most of the city's retail corridors with almost no urban design regulations in place. Interestingly enough, actually, some of the most robust urban design regulations in the city are on the north end of Staten Island, which is a little unexpected, but it was really eye-opening to realize maybe we should talk about that a little more. So in the places where streetscape regulations do exist, they're often pretty inconsistent. So for example, some special districts only care about some issues like storefront transparency while remaining completely silent on others, for example, curb cut location. And so the task here was to develop an overarching streetscape framework that harmonizes the range of rules in places with existing streetscape regulations, while also extending these rules to places that currently don't have any rules. So some research questions that we wanted to address were: where in commercial districts are new buildings being constructed, and how are ground floors being constructed in areas with rules versus without? And so the exercise that we undertook utilized Map Pluto data, and the methodology that we employed was filtering Pluto data for addresses of all new buildings constructed in commercial overlays. So those are the C1 and C2 districts that Chris and Nick mentioned earlier, and then also C4 districts between 2010 and 2020. And so we used a Python image scraper to extract street view imagery for over 2,000 newly constructed buildings across the city. And you can see a little snapshot of that on the right-hand side of the screen. What you don't see is the giant spreadsheet that we then used to evaluate these images and the ground floor conditions of these new buildings and how they were contributing to how they were contributing to their surrounding streetscapes and also existing corridor conditions. So what we essentially did was catalog all of the rules that currently exist in the zoning, and then we took these images and basically saw whether or not they were constructed with or without these rules in place, and then what types of elements were addressed. So for example, we looked at this list of things: so ground floor use requirement, minimum transparency, parking wrap and screening, maximum lobby width, curb cut restrictions, and blank wall mitigations. And so an example of how this could work is, for example, if there is a commercial corridor that doesn't have any rules, but is choosing to employ certain elements of streetscape, would it make sense to then encourage surrounding buildings to also do the same? And so that's kind of the approach that we took as we looked at these over 2,000 buildings, which are the points that you see on the screen. And so what we were able to do with that information was establish a consistent citywide framework for commercial ground floor design requirements that is more stringent in places with greater pedestrian activity and more flexible and auto-oriented areas. What we were trying to do was create a baseline set of rules. We weren't trying to impose any rules that were too restrictive on places that maybe weren't able to accommodate them, but we wanted to provide most places with at least mitigations to the worst outcomes, and while also supporting places that already had existing rules and kind of preserving the character of those rules. And so you'll see that what kind of informed the final framework was the transit zone, areas that are deemed more transit rich, would be prescribed a more stringent set of rules, while areas that weren't would maybe be provided a little more flexibility. That's not to say that they can't choose to adopt those rules, but they wouldn't be required to do them because of potential limitations based on where they're located in the city. And so here's just a quick overview of the framework that we developed. The most stringent tier of rules is Tier C rules. They apply to designated streets in special purpose districts and in other geographies. So an example of a designated street could be Fulton in downtown Brooklyn. And here you would have ground floor use requirements, lobby length restrictions, a transparency requirement, parking enclosure requirements, curb cut location rules, and then also loading berth location rules. And then the Tier B set of rules is kind of that intermediate set of rules, and it would just generally apply to commercial districts and mixed-use districts in the transit zone. And it would regulate things like ground floor use, lobby length, transparency, parking enclosure, and curb cut location. And then we actually created this alternate set of Tier B rules because we realized that across commercial districts, there were slight variations in character based on things like adjacency to a residential district or adjacency to a manufacturing district. And so we wanted to be able to accommodate those things and not impose rules that were too strict, again, in places that maybe didn't have the capacity to handle them. So we would just regulate things like parking location and route because those definitely play a very huge role in the pedestrian experience when you're walking down a commercial street, and then also blank wall mitigations. And then lastly is Tier A. It's the most flexible set of rules. It applies to commercial districts and mixed-use districts outside of the transit zone. And it would just regulate things like parking location and screening, and also blank walls. And then in a separate exercise that we're not going to go over today, we were looking at areas that were approximate to highway entrances and highway ramps, expressway ramps. And we also looked at large shopping centers that were far away from transit. And we decided that we would provide exemptions to these types of areas based on their urban characteristics. For example, very, very large shopping districts will have multiple frontages. They sit on large acres of land, and it wouldn't be common sense to be applying these types of rules to settings like that. And so that's it for this presentation. I just wanted to direct you to some resources where you can learn more about the City of Yes. You can go to nyc.gov/yes economic opportunity. There you'll find the full annotated zoning text. You'll find the project description and also the use group table translations that Chris and our team worked on. And also the EDR, which is our economic development and regional planning team. They released this economic snapshot that will give you a little more information on jobs and storefront vacancy information within each community board. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrew, and we'll start the Q&A portion of this presentation.
I'll start off by opening it up to the audience if anyone has a question they'd like to ask the panel.
Okay, it seems to me, and I'm like some of the zoning laws here, it seems to me that the mixed city zoning laws are quite challenging. I'm a little bit cumbersome in terms of, as a lay person trying to figure it out. So how much of that in terms of the zoning, because we all know New York City, the rent is high. So how much is the zoning impacting New York to operate as its utmost in terms of effectively, right? Because you mentioned storefronts vacancy. Mm-hmm. So my thing is, now you got limited space for people to actually open up a business. I'm understanding you clearly. Mm-hmm. So those means you have demand's high, but you got limited supply. So I'm just trying to figure this out. Can you speak to that?
Great. Thank you for your question. And these are very valid, concerns and points. And I just want to caveat, by saying that zoning is not the end all be all, but we do want to make sure that the zoning works for businesses. And, part of this exercise, part of this project, revealed a lot of, challenges that businesses have to face. And one of the primary events is like, where do I find space to open up my business, right? And there's a lot of restrictions in the zoning, a lot of outdated restrictions that make it very hard for businesses to find space. Not just like in different parts of the city, but also within the same building. And so part of economic opportunity is to relax the schools, is to make sure that, we have, we can utilize land as much as possible to provide for these opportunities for like the mom and pop shop to open up on the ground floor, or if there is, opportunity in the high commercial density areas to open up a restaurant on the rooftop, we want that to happen as well. The other example is, we're seeing a lot of custom manufacturing businesses are coming up, but we want to make sure that those businesses are, in commercial areas as well, and not just limited to manufacturing and industrial districts. And that is currently the case today, is that the zoning doesn't distinguish between the scale of, different types of production uses, right? So if I'm opening up a bakery, today in the zoning, it considers it as an industrial use as opposed to, the commercial, somewhat custom manufacturing use, right? So these are the different types of ways in which we're trying to address the issue of, like, we have only so much space in New York City, and we want to make sure that, we give as much opportunity for businesses to find their space to grow.
I think there's so much that zoning can do to fix some of these issues, just realizing that zoning is not the panacea to everything. But this exercise was specifically interesting because of the vacancy scenario and the issue. And it just lifts one of those hurdles, which was, if you're vacant for 2 years, then you cannot open a business anymore, which sounds, not right. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Thank you.
Of course.
I have a question. So, so sounds like you guys are doing a lot of deregulation, or remove all the regulations, and I imagine that sort of process as we get through the zone. How long does it typically take to remove certain regulations, and what kind of hurdles do you guys encounter, and how would you what's your guys' advice to navigate this sort of environment?
Thank you for your question. Our agency works on so many different types of projects, and sometimes they're just very specific to a topic, like transit access, creating transit easements and elevators near subway stations, right? And that's very specific, and it's not, the scope of it is much more limited than, say, what we're doing. And occasionally we get something like this, which hasn't happened in many, many years, where, this idea of reinventing our use framework is something that we've been working on under this administration for the last, couple of years. But in reality, it's, work that that really started back in the 90s. Our predecessors in the agency, they were already looking at this work and studying, like, how does use regulations affect businesses, and how does it work against businesses, and so we're really just expanding on their work right here. So it varies from project to project and depending on the scope. In this case, this took several years, and this again, they did a lot of the work back in the 90s, but we also branched off from their work, and hopefully this project will be adopted. Some of the challenges here, I'm just thinking, reimagining the use framework itself is already challenging enough, because there's certain things that we do want to change. There's certain things that we do want to reimagine, like the use groups, for instance, right? But there's other types of regulations where we have to just keep in place based on the decisions that were made, from several years ago, that were diligently reviewed by the public. And so we don't want to undo all those things. And so that's why part of the exercise is actually assigning, like, the crosswalk of uses. Assigning the existing uses to the NAICS categorization is so important, because we want to make sure that the framework works for certain provisions like that. But I think the more challenging part is, we're introducing something new, and something new can be quite daunting to people. It's quite daunting to us, but it's also quite daunting to the public. So when we go out into the public and we're explaining things to people, and they're seeing a whole new use framework, they're scratching their head and they're being like, how to what extent is this going to change my neighborhood, right? So, that was one of the biggest challenges that we experienced during the public review process, is to explain to people, like, okay, this is our goal, this is our intention, to make it easier for businesses to operate in the city. And there are certain things that we're proposing in addition to that. And we really welcome your feedback, and we want to work with you to make sure that this policy is sound.
In terms of the designing these streetscapes, it seems like some of the like qualities that you're looking at are more aesthetic, like having blank walls, and some of them are more functional, like where the curb cuts are. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about like weighing like aesthetic concerns versus functional concerns, and if like one of those is more important, or like where they both sort of fit into zoning regulations.
Yeah, so for example, the blank wall regulations already exist in the zoning. They're generally applied in floodplains, so areas where they have like more permissive design rules because they want to, mitigate the impacts of inland flooding and coastal flooding. And so we kind of adapted those rules and applied them to our streetscape framework here because we were noticing in our research that a lot of buildings were just leaving these like really, really large stretches of blank walls. And if there was a tool that we could leverage to kind of mitigate the safety impacts and like, I guess the aesthetic impacts as well of these types of walls, why we should leverage that tool. So that's one way that we decided to address these more like aesthetic concerns. Transparency is also a rule that is like largely applied across special districts today, and also certain geographies such as like high density commercial and residential, like for example, high density residential areas that also have like commercial overlays mapped on them. So you will see that largely on like the Upper West Side. And so we thought we could also adapt those rules as well. The standard is like 50%. I don't know if that's getting too into the weeds, but it's like half of like frontage should be glazed with transparent materials. And so that's kind of a rule that we adapted when we were building up this framework as well. And then in terms of curb cut location, curb cuts are kind of like a beast in the zoning. Every special district kind of has their own rule. Every type of geography kind of has their own rule. And so that was the hardest to regulate. And so what we decided to do there, for example, was if you're located on a corner lot and you have two frontages, like you should put it on the narrow frontage, basically the frontage that isn't on the main corridor, so that people feel a little more safe when they're walking down the street. It's probably the most flexible rule that we introduced within this project, the streetscape aspect of this project, but we were trying to do our best with the tools that we had, considering streamlining all of the curb cut regulations in the zoning would take a very, very long time. So we tried to do what we could with the means that we had. Yeah. I hope, does that answer your question?
Thank you for your presentation. I was really interested to learn about zoning at this granular level. I had a couple of questions. The first one is, I imagine you were getting a lot of input from businesses, and I wanted to ask if you could speak to industry capture and how you were able to, or not able to, avoid it. Meaning, how were you able to maintain like the perspective that you are public servants and have duty for the public and not just the business? And to speak to that. And then my second question is, New York City, I think, is like going through like a pivotal moment where brick and mortar is sort of like an outdated way to do business, just in general, especially in the post-COVID climate. How did you contemplate that in this project? And could you speak to that? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. I mean, the engagement process of, going out to all these small businesses and stakeholders, I think one of the takeaways is that zoning is very confusing and is hard to navigate. I think that's what we heard clearly from people. Our team, the specific team that went out there, summarized, these findings, and the main message is that, we have to declutter the zoning as much as possible. That said, we're not necessarily, I mean, it is a good point. We are not just serving the interests of the businesses, but we're serving the interests of the city as a whole because we're public servants. But, it's over time, we've noticed that actually the zoning is a detriment to a lot of businesses, and that, we want to make sure that the zoning regulations itself is accessible to anybody, right? So again, if I'm just opening up a hardware store, it's ridiculous that I would have to hire a land use attorney to navigate through all of these bylaws, as opposed to me being a hardware store owner, going online and looking at our zoning and finding the places where those rules pertain to my specific business. So we always think about that in mind, is that like, we want to try and make it as easy to use. And so that's one of the reasons why we've conducted all of these work and research to find the best solution possible for this specific project.
I was just going to add to that really quick. I'm sorry. I think on the first part of your question, I would say that especially on this proposal, as well as anything else that gets released on our website, or that we note, we're clear to note all the folks that we engage with, especially in something like this, where like our industry partners or other agencies involved. And in my experience over the years, like we certainly, depending on the context, whether it's like a very specific manufacturing type industry, we're communicating with them, we're communicating with business improvement districts, whatever the case may be. We are involved we do robust communication. I also would like to mention, you talked about the mom and pop stores or the decline and those types of industries. I'd like to direct you to a storefront vacancy report that our agency released in 2019 that speaks to a little bit about the points that you brought up. That's available, like I said, on our website. We also had a 2020, summer 2020 retail vacancy or storefront vacancy report that I co-led, which is also available to look into. And very broadly, I would say that I agree with you that some of these, e-commerce is on the rise, but I would say that it does depend on the industry and its ability to, I don't like that word pivot, but for lack of a better term, right? But to have flexibility. And that flexibility speaks to a lot of the concerns of this proposal, right? We want zoning to get out of our own way and allow for, businesses and the city to evolve and grow and be more flexible.
1 minute question.
Yeah, I just have a question. Given that these data captures an specific moment in time, like I'm curious how you use data or think about data then and like planning to the future and not kind of wanting to repeat what happened in the 60s of having kind of like the data you're looking at then map onto the future, if that makes sense.
How do we how are we not stuck in a period in time and these data are flexible for the future, right? I just want to speak specifically to the NAICS codes that Chris talked about. A big reason for choosing that classification system is that it's updated every 5 years. So we're not only we're in sync with what this standard for the national industry standards are doing. So necessarily because it's going to be updated, we have to then reference those things and be flexible. Right.